Hello, everyone. My name is Albert Welter. I'm from the University of Arizona. Let me begin by thanking the Tung Yuen International Conference organizers for this wonderful conference. The theme on Buddhist Canons in Search of a Theoretical Foundation for a Wisdom-Oriented Education. Also, I'd like to thank the Center for Buddhist Studies of the University of Hong Kong for help putting this conference program together. We may all live in interesting and challenging times, but I think the current atmosphere that we're in is particularly relevant and apropos for a conference like this. So it's my great honor to be here and to present to you. My presentation reviews attempts in Chinese Buddhism to retrieve meaning from the Buddhist Canon. It's is predicated on the premise that however beneficial the printing of the canon was for various elites, it presented a problem to end users, tasked with deriving meaning from it for their own religious and spiritual practices. Retrieving here thus refers to regaining possession of, putting right, or improving. By extension, it may be taken as rectifying, remedying, or restoring meaning that eludes practitioners when confronting the massiveness of the canon and the variability of its contents. For those with sufficient means, printing the canon resulted in a welcome display of merit, a gift of unequal value. In spite of the attraction that gaining such merit had for the producers, what of the value of its contents to regular end users, those who actually read and applied its various messages? For most practitioners, the Buddhist canon represents a massive corpus, impressive in size, but otherwise unwieldy. Witness the comments of Ding Fu Bao, which I have translated here, whose sentiments typify the frustrations encountered upon entering the Sea of Scriptures. How vast the Sea of Scriptures. As soon as you wade in, it's a boundless expanse without a shore. All who peer at the ocean of Scriptures sigh with despair. It is as if we are in a boat on the ocean and encounter a sudden storm of angry waves. One glimpse at the limitlessness and all the passengers look at each other in fear. But the boatmen intuitively know where it is peaceful and calm. They assume control without difficulty and follow the boat's natural course to finally reach the other shore. How could they not rely on something called a compass? If piloting a boat is like this, how could navigating the Sea of Scriptures be any different? So Ding's call for a compass to investigate or to navigate the Sea of Scriptures resonates throughout the Chinese Buddhist tradition from its inception. Because of the enormity of the Buddhist canon, the Buddhist faithful look to creative ways to manage and use the contents in keeping with their own religious and spiritual aspirations. And my presentation today would like to review some of those attempts at dealing with the scriptures in the Chinese Buddhist tradition. To give you an idea of the immensity of the canon for those who aren't familiar with it, let's take a look at the Sino-East Asian Buddhist canon that was printed in the early part of the 20th century in Japan, which is still widely used as the base canon for researchers throughout the world. If we look at the categorizations in this canon and you see the number of different types of categories that are employed in order to catalog the numerous scriptures contained in, you see, begin to see the massiveness. Altogether, for example, there are nearly 3,000 texts that are included in this canon. So this gives you an idea of the immensity, the diversity that faces people who try to unravel the message that's contained in the canon. This is a problem that is endemic in the Chinese Buddhist tradition. If we look at Hui Zhao's Gaoseng Zhuan, which was compiled around 520 to chart the past to eminence using 10 categories, we begin to see the enormity. I'd like to use this to look at the enormity of the problem that we're facing. But first of all, I would note that Huijiao's non-sectarian methodology was continued with minor variation in subsequent printings of the Gaosengchuan genre. The Shu Gaosengchuan printed in the 7th century, and the Song Gaosengchuan printed in the 10th century. These together represent a major source for understanding developments in Chinese Buddhism. If we take a close look at Huijiao's categories, we see in number 1 and number 2, we see translators and particularly number 2, exegetes. And you see the number of biographies that are contained in each of these categories. Exegetes represents an overwhelming 53% of the total number of biographies included. Translators is second with 12.6. Together they represent 66%, so roughly 2/3 of the entire biographies recorded in the Gaosengchuan. What does this tell us? This tells us that the immensity of the canon was a problem from the very beginning of the Chinese experience with Buddhism, translating the Indian and Central Asian texts into Chinese, and more importantly, the exegetical work, the attempt to understand, to clarify, to come to terms with that meaning was the major preoccupation in the early Buddhist tradition. It is important also to note that the problem of the Buddhist canon was not just an issue in Chinese and East Asian Buddhism, but was widespread throughout Buddhist traditions. In a different context, Theravada Buddhist scholars came up with the notion of a practical canon. Stephen Collins suggests that actual canons of scriptures, as opposed to an authoritative canon, varied in usage according to time and place. Anne Blackburn designates this authoritative canon as a quote-unquote formal canon and distinguishes it from the more restrictive set of texts that were produced, collected, read, recited, and interpreted as a practical canon. Philip Stanley, in reference to the Tibetan Buddhist canon, argues for the notion of an inclusive canon, all the texts known to a tradition that it accepts as Buddhist, in addition to those used in a practical canon or included in a formal canon. One other thing that I would like to note is that the use of the English word canon, the definition of it, has two meanings. One is, as we commonly employ it here, a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine, authentic, the entirety of the canon. But the second one is as a general law, rule, or principle or criterion by which something is judged. And I think when we apply this second definition, we begin to get to the idea of the practical canon that is suggested by some of the scholars that I refer to here. I now turn to the strategies employed by Chinese Buddhists to deal with the immensity of the canon. The first strategy was the literal turning of the wheel of the Dharma in rotating sutra cabinets. There were those who took the notion of turning the wheel of the Dharma more literally. Cabinets for storing Buddhist scriptures, commonly housed in special buildings called sutra halls, were built in China from around the northern and southern dynasties. That would be the 5th and 6th centuries. And they became more common in the Tang and Song dynasties and more popular in the Yuan, and continued into the Ming and Qing periods when rituals for turning the sutra wheel were frequently recorded. Two rotating cabinets have survived from the Song period. One is the Zhuanlun Zang of the Longxing Temple, which I pictured here in Hebei province. The other is located in Sichuan. And also, following this model, these rotating sutra cabinets were also built in China and Korea. The second strategy for dealing with the immensity of the Buddhist canon was represented by imported Buddhist schools. The inspiration to reduce the enormity of the Buddhist canon to a manageable size is emblematic of the formation of Buddhist schools in India. Predecessors in the Chinese Buddhist tradition faced similar challenges and came up with creative strategies and solutions. One such means was to select and rally around a certain body of philosophically and doctrinally consistent scriptures, such as was done with the Sanmun or Madhyamika school, or the Welter and Yogacara schools in India. These were schools that were formulated in India, but were transmitted and translated rather wholesale and established in the Chinese context as well. Another strategy for dealing with the massive corpus of the Buddhist canon evolved into the well-known Panjiao system of classification that effectively dissected the canon into a hierarchical doctrinal taxonomy, providing a sectarian guide to the most advanced and thus most important teachings. The main examples of this are found in the two major Chinese Buddhist schools, Tiantai and Huayan. In each case, the periods of the Buddhist teaching career are divided up according to the teachings that he did at each phase. So what we have is a kind of a progressive development of the Buddhist teaching according to each tradition. Now, each of these traditions, Tiantai and Huayan, while they alleged that the Buddhist teaching developed in this manner, they disagreed as to what represented the highest, most authoritative, or the final teaching of the Buddha. In Tiantai tradition, this is represented by the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra. This represents the culmination of the Buddhist preaching career. And in the Huayan tradition, this is represented by the teachings of the Avatamsaka Sutra or the Huayan Jing. Both cases effectively take the immensity of the canon and reduce it to a single scripture or set of scriptures by which that provide a window into the canon and in which the entirety of the canon can be interpreted. So this provides a very convenient and effective framework for reducing the immensity of the canon to the teaching of a single sutra. And this becomes the way in which the canon can be understood and digested in a meaningful way. Another strategy to deal with the immensity of the canon is represented by Yongming Yancho and the Tsongqing Lu. Upon surveying the massive output represented in the canon, Yancho constructed an abridged version that is aspired to provide a digest of the entire corpus of the canon. In his own words, his aim is to make evident the great purpose of the patriarchs and Buddhas and the correct implicit truth of Buddhist scriptures and treatises. He wants to advance that universal mind is the implicit truth, revealing the myriad dharmas like a mirror. He brings together the profound doctrines formulated in times past, and he selects and summarizes what is contained throughout the entire corpus of writings in the entire canon of Buddhist scriptures. And he refers to these as records. He uses a three-part strategy throughout his work. The section 1 establishes the correct implicit truth, which he regards as the ultimate goal. Section 2 puts forth questions and answers used to dispel any doubts. And section 3 cites from the corpus of Buddhist scriptures and writings for verification. A fifth strategy is an interesting one that was used, and this was to form what I term as an alternate canon. Beyond sectarian and scholastic restrictions and abridgments to the Buddhist canon, there were other attempts in East Asia to circumvent the formal canon and bring the notion of a canon into manageable form. Most notably, there were those in the Linji Chan school who dispensed with the traditional canon altogether, criticizing it as a derivative representative of Buddhist teachings, and posited the Yulu, the dialogue or discourse records of Chan masters as a new and more authentic canon in place of the traditional body of scriptures. They term this a special transmission outside the scriptures, Jiaowai Biechuan. This trend came to fruition in the Song dynasty, manifesting itself in three interrelated textual forms. Lamp records or Dunglus, which recorded the activities and teachings of illustrious Chan masters in biographical form following a lineage framework. Then we have dialogue records or Yulu. These were expanded records of the activities and teachings of individual Chan masters that were originally recorded in the Dunglu or lamp records. And finally, we have Gongan collections, excerpted events, episodes from the lives of individual masters, raised for discussion and considered as a heuristic teaching advice for others. As records of the alleged words and activities of living Buddhas in China, Chan records served as an alternate canon, representative of a presumably more authentic canon than the one inherited from India and translated into Chinese. Next, I turn to a sixth Buddhist strategy to deal with the Buddhist canon, and these are esoteric formula or dharani. So dharani represent a different type of critique of canonical scriptures. It encapsulates the meaning of a section or chapter of a sutra and ultimately provides a kind of mysterious access to the truth implicit in the entire canon itself. Dharani take many forms, too numerous to account for here, but they are all based on similar presumptions regarding a secret transmission of esoteric lore, accessible in part through magical utterances believed to communicate meaningfully with Buddhas and other Buddhist spiritual beings. This privileged access to a true Buddha realm either circumvents or augments the more cumbersome access provided by the traditional Buddhist canon and Buddhist practices associated with it. While these are too numerous to mention, I give you three examples here. One is the great mantra of Prajnaparamita recorded in the Heart Sutra, Gate Gate Paragate Parasangate Bodhisvaha. Then another one is recorded in fascicle 26 of the Lotus Sutra, which I'm not going to read, but it's there before you. And another interesting example is the Precious Chest Dharani Sutra, which I'll have occasion to talk about later, which was a short Dharani Sutra, including a Dharani within it that was concealed within stupas as a representation of the essence and the intrinsic esoteric meaning of Buddhism in Dharani form. Next, I would like to turn to the theme of the current conference, looking at the canon as a window into wisdom. And I would like to ask the question, what is the present and future of historical Buddhist strategies to deal with the canon? Historically, Buddhist strategies were used to reduce the density and complexity of the canon to a manageable form. And I would maintain that these are still being used today. There are many Buddhist groups who are representatives of the traditions that come out of the strategies to deal with the canon that I've outlined today. And historically, these serve two purposes and continue to do so. One, they act as repositories for how the canon is currently approached, as the legacies of past attempts are still very much with us. And secondly, they help inform contemporary attempts to formulate new approaches. The previous examples on how to access the Buddhist wisdom may help us devise new approaches suitable to our present circumstances. Many of our efforts to answer these questions are circumscribed by the Buddhist orientations toward wisdom in the global present. And by here, I want to point out the influence of international Buddhist groups formulated largely in the West, and the influence that they have had over Buddhist studies and I think orientations toward the Buddhist canon. I'm speaking here specifically of the influence of Protestant Buddhist foundationalism and privileging the historical Buddha and the Pali Canon. And the question then is, what is Protestant Buddhist foundationalism? Sometimes when I've talked about this, I've used the word fundamentalism as opposed to foundationalism. But fundamentalism is a very loaded term these days, which cuts across many different traditions. So I think foundationalism is maybe more appropriate, and that's the term that I'm using here with you today. What do we mean when we use the term Protestant Buddhism? The term was coined by Obayasgari for a Sri Lankan by the name of Anagarika Dharmapala, who was active in the early part of the 20th century. He was the leader of a Buddhist protest and revival movement, and he put forth the idea of Buddhism as a religion compatible with science and Western values. As early as 1973, David L. Snellgrove made explicit the problems associated with the Protestant-inspired quest for the historical Buddha. He writes, despite the admonitions of responsible scholars, writers of books on Buddhism still tend to assume that a reasonably historical account of the life and personal teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha may be extracted from the earliest available canonical sources. The quest of the historical Buddha began as a Western 19th century interest, imitating both in its presuppositions and its methods of inquiry the parallel quest of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. In deliberate response to the famous 19th century German Indologist Hermann Oldenburg, who produced a widely read book on Buddhism, Buddha sein Leben, sein Lehr, sein Gemeinde, which translates into English, Buddha, his life, his doctrine, his order. Snellgrove writes, within the terms of his enunciated principles, Oldenburg's work is responsible and scholarly. He has created a figure of the historical Buddha which has been now popularly accepted by Westerners and by Westernized Asians. However, cast as it is in the mold of European 19th century liberal and rational thought, it might seem to bear on examination no relationship with the religious aspirations and conceptions relating to Shakyamuni Buddha, as revealed in the earliest Buddhist literature. Furthermore, it easily can be shown that the whole process of deliberately abstracting everything of an apparent unhistorical and mythical character all too often leads away from any semblance of historical truth. Following up with this, Gregory Chopin underscored the Protestant presuppositions of the European discoverers of Buddhism. These presuppositions have determined our characterization of the history of Indian Buddhism, and that this characterization reflects more Protestant history and values than Indian Buddhist history and values. To make explicit the Protestant paradigm suggested in the motivations to focus on the study of early Buddhism, let me suggest the following parallels. Shakyamuni was viewed as the true originator of Buddhism, akin to the position of Jesus in Christianity. The dialogues of the Buddha, the alleged record of Shakyamuni's teachings, were likened to the Christian New Testament, the record of Jesus' activities and teachings. Subsequent elaborations and explanations of Buddhist teachings were regarded as deterioration or corruption of Shakyamuni's original message, just as Catholic doctrinal explanations came to be viewed as a perversion of the pure original Christianity developed by Jesus and his early followers as revealed in the New Testament. The quest of the Protestant discoverers of Buddhism for the original true teachings of the historical Buddha came to be associated with true Buddhism in a manner not unlike the Protestant quest for the historical Jesus and true Christianity. Where does that leave us? I'm basically an academic historian, and I don't feel it's within my purview to make predictions or even suggestions about what the window into wisdom would look like in the future. But in contrast to what I've just explained about the Protestant orientations and its influence over Buddhist studies, I would like to propose or suggest a Mahayana response for the future. And in doing so, I think the best and primary place to look at is encapsulated in the short Heart Sutra text, which provides a kind of an interesting model and framework for Mahayana, and it may provide a similar pretext for future formulations of the canon and the idea of wisdom. The Heart Sutra is compiled of two parts. It's a very short text, as you know, and the first part takes up the bulk of the text. It's what I call the philosophical analysis that kind of debunks the so-called Hinayana perspective toward the five skandhas, and to look at Hinayana as basically a replication of some kind of atomistic theory of existence. And of course, the famous formula, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, introduces the famous Mahayana concept of shunya or sunyata, emptiness, as it should be applied to even the analysis of the five skandhas. But after this philosophical analysis, which does a kind of in a very short amount of space, does a very deep dive into the nature of reality according to Mahayana Buddhism. But at the very end, it takes a sudden and to many an unexpected turn. It introduces a dharani, and a dharani that represents the essence of Buddhist wisdom. And that can be recited easily and encapsulate the wisdom of all of the Buddhas. This gate, paragate, parasangate, bodhisvaha. So this kind of combination of philosophical analysis and quote unquote dharani practice may look like a model that can be suitable moving forward. We as academics, we like philosophical analysis. We like to do deep dives into texts and their meanings and so forth. But in actual fact, not so many Buddhist practitioners are oriented that way. So the idea of dharani practice or religious practice, or if you want to say the magical, the mystical element of religion, I think whether we as academics like it or not, it will persist, and it needs to be validated in some kind of form. Using my historical studies on Buddhism, let me give you another example, a similar example of what I've just outlined in the Heart Sutra. And this is what I call the Leifang Pagoda matrix. The Leifang Pagoda, as many of you will know, is a famous pagoda that stood for centuries, originally erected in the 10th century on Westlake, famous Westlake in Hangzhou, and finally toppled through neglect in the early 20th century, and was rebuilt at the very beginning of the 21st century, and stands again as a monument on Westlake, and is one of Hangzhou's most frequented tourist attractions. But the archaeological discoveries that accompanied the excavation of Leifang Pagoda after it fell down and was reconstructed, they came across the bricks with holes in them that had inside rolled up copies of the Dharani Sutra, the Precious Chest Seal Dharani Sutra, which were concealed in the bricks. And it also reminded us that the original complex had, at the bottom, on the outside, it had copies of Buddhist scriptures etched around the perimeter of the base of the pagoda, and especially the Huayan Sutra. So this suggests to me this kind of combination of esoteric teaching and exoteric teaching together that kind of encapsulated and formulated the Buddhism of that particular time and place. Again, I think it represents a kind of model that may be suitable as we look forward as a kind of a Mahayana response to the window into wisdom that we're looking at here. So I conclude with a thought from Ding Fu Bao, which I read to you at the beginning of the presentation, and with a question: where are the boatmen of our present age who intuitively know where it is peaceful and calm to assume control, and employing a compass can guide us to the other shore? I appreciate your discussion and any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your lectures. You say there is a problem with the Buddhist canon. You know, what we understand as a Buddhist canon is a reserve or deposit all the Buddha's teachings there. And whenever we need something, we take out the teaching and teach others. As you mentioned, something like a Fang San Si Jing, for example, they carved all the sutras on the stones, and just in case there's happening like persecution, so you our sutra and start to teach again. And what do you think about this kind of idea?
Well, I think the premise of my talk was, when I look at it historically, I see the development of Chinese Buddhism as a series of developments to deal with the immensity of the canon. That the immensity of the canon itself is a kind of problem. When it first came to China, as you know, people didn't understand that you know, there was the Hinayana period, the Mahayana period, and so on and so forth. They thought it was all were the teachings of the historical Buddha. So they temporalized it into the preaching career of Shakyamuni. But still, you know, there is such an immensity of teachings there. I mean, you know as well as I do, once in a while when you're reading monks' biographies, they talk about somebody who read the entire canon in, I don't know, some such period of time, right? Because it's a fantastic achievement. Well, probably maybe almost impossible achievement. I don't know how much they absorb by doing it, but obviously the immensity of the canon itself was well, it was something that had to be tamed, right? And so that's what I looked at, is the strategies that with which that they used to tame the canon. And you know, I mentioned the Panjiao system. I mentioned you know, the doctrinal taxonomy system like Yuen and Tiantai. I mentioned the Indian Buddhist schools that were translated to China, like Madhyamaka and Yogacara. You know, I mentioned, you know, Yongming Yensho did the digest of the canon and the Songjing Lu. I mentioned the Chan school tried to circumvent the canon by minimizing its importance and tried to really come up with an alternate canon, which was their own native Chan masters and their Yulu as a kind of a substitute canon. And then I also looked at the Dharani as a way. And I think, you know, all of these, every era, every time and place, you know, what my point is that every time and place they have to deal with this issue. And Ding Fu Bao, if you missed the beginning, I quoted Ding Fu Bao at the beginning. In the early 20th century, he pointed out the very same issue, that, you know, the canon's too big for us to really understand and digest it all. And as you say, yeah, okay, so we pick from it, but the question then is, what do we pick? How do we pick? Who does the picking? You know, and you know, it raises all these kinds of questions. And my analysis was just to kind of look at, do a historical survey of kind of what has been done in the past. And then, you know, at the end, I looked at, you know, because, you know, even when I was able to go to China, when I was in China, and like in Hangzhou, they have this connection with Sri Lanka that, you know, and somehow that Sri Lanka represents real Buddhism somehow. And of course, it's not quite, you know, they don't quite put it that way, but they kind of set up, you know, and this is a very interesting phenomenon, because I think historically, Chinese Buddhists did not have to deal with this kind of contemporary, simultaneous looking at other traditions and judging themselves perhaps by those traditions and trying to look at and maybe questioning their own practices as a result of that. And, so that's what led me, okay, so why do we privilege Sri Lankan Buddhism? And maybe in China, not everybody does, but certainly I think there is a tendency among international Buddhists in the Westerners and especially practitioners. They look at the historical Buddha as that is the foundation of real Buddhism. And my point isn't to dismiss that, but just as the Protestants kind of did away with all of the tradition that followed Jesus and his disciples, all the centuries of Catholic interpretation and the development of traditions around the world, I think this kind of Protestant Buddhism, that the tendency was to do the same, to try and diminish the authenticity of actual Buddhist practice that was being practiced in communities in Asia outside of, outside of India. I mean, the irony of this, of course, is that when the European discoverers of Buddhism, when they discovered Buddhism, there was no Buddhism in India, right? And of course, in effect, there was no Buddhism. So they actually reimagined Buddhism. Of course, Sri Lanka became very important because that was the closest kind of place where Buddhism was practiced in its quote unquote pure Indian form. But anyway, that's that was the dynamic that I was trying to set up. And as I said, I'm kind of an academic historian. It's not my place to suggest where this idea of wisdom should go for Buddhist practitioners. But then I went ahead and did it anyway.
Thank you so much. You discussed it, 7 responses. It's a very brilliant idea, quite inspiring. In fact, when listening to your talk, very nice. And
well, thank you.
Just kind of curious, from me. What do you think the historical Buddha? Do you think it's a real person or not?
That's a
argument. Still argument. Some scholars say no.
Well, no. Here's what I think. Okay, so was there a historical person that was the Buddha? Yeah, I think there probably was. I mean, but it's a little bit. Was there a historical person called Jesus? Yes, there was. But what we have, our image of them is a persona that's created by later followers. I can even say, I studied Linji Xuan, and Linji, everybody, we have all, anybody who looks at the Linji Lu, has a very strong impression of who Linji was as a person, because his dynamism comes across very clearly. But, when I looked at the text and the way it was developed, it's a historical construct, even, Linji, the Linji Lu's like 200 years after Linji died, and the earliest records, they show this kind of evolution of developing this kind of dynamic figure that we associate with Linji. It's a historical construct. So and I believe there was a historical person, Linji, of course, I believe that. And I think there was a historical person called Buddha, but I don't think that we can, if we ask ourselves the question, who is that person, we're asking ourselves the wrong question, because that assumes that we can know it through the records, that the records are going to kind of give us a direct line back to who they were. And all we get are the filtered versions, and so we need to look at these as filtered versions and kind of understand them as filtered versions. So anyway.
Yeah, that's totally true. I completely agree with you. The Buddhist canon is growing, bigger now.
Yeah.
Adding so much, as you said.
Well, and if I could just add, because Guangxing, while I've got you here, I mean, because, I look at, looking at it from the Western perspective, we've got, Jin knows this very well as well, that, the Chinese Buddhist canon is one Buddhist canon among many. I mean, we've got such a smorgasbord of practitioners of Buddhism, in the West, whether, either coming from Sri Lanka, from Thailand, from Tibet, from Japan, from Korea, from China, and various traditions embedded within each of these kind of linguistic groups. So it's quite a smorgasbord that I think it's quite unique. That makes the situation kind of quite unique. And I think even in places like China, I realized that for example, other developments in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, or even in Western Buddhism, are obviously quite influential within China as well. So the situation is very complex, and that's why I left with this idea of that we need the boatmen who can guide us through this, navigate us through these very turbulent waters to kind of make some kind of new sense for us. Obviously, what I like about your conference, I mean, the world needs a new paradigm. There's no question. I mean, and that's not new information, but it becomes more abundantly clear as things progress. And so, how can Buddhism contribute to this new paradigm, I guess, is the question as I would see it. Thank you
so much, Albert. Thank you. Thank you.